Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a gorgeous Wednesday in late October, the 21st day of October. It is absolutely beautiful. The temperature, our temperature today will go up near 70, I'm sure, by the time the afternoon is over, as the leaves turn and fall and cover more and more of the yard. It is absolutely a beautiful day in a beautiful part of the year in one of the most beautiful states. Oh, that we can keep it that way. One of the most beautiful states in the Union. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this, our third day of broadcast here at the Virtual Center this week. Of course, this is our final broadcast of the week. We won't be back together again live until next Monday. But we have our full 2 hours of programming today, and I'm really excited about it, and I hope that I can make your time spent with us today worth your while as well. We do look forward to hearing from you. We have a phone line reserved to get you on the air so that your views and questions, ideas, suggestions, comments can be shared not only with me, but mostly with other folks who are tuning in. I know that they would appreciate it and love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly that way, my email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, lowercase, all one word, at gmail.com. And if you would like to take the opportunity to visit our Facebook page, I know that all of us would appreciate it. Our Facebook page, if you go to Facebook, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will gain access to our page. Over the last several days, I've posted 3 or 4 different things on there. I'm becoming a little bit more conscious of the page, I guess I would say. And I've made an effort to try to make postings that are not quite as lengthy as some of the first ones I put on there. I know that, and very honestly, I had to learn this myself because up until about 2 months ago, I was not a Facebook reader at all. And over the last 2 months, I've become like everybody else, interested in looking at Facebook just to see what's on there. And one of the things I've noticed in myself is that when somebody posts something that is fairly lengthy, given the fact that my priority is to go through what's on Facebook, then I'm kind of disinclined to get into anything too lengthy. And it pretty much is reinforced in my own mind the fact that I should make a conscious effort to reduce the length of whatever I put on Facebook. And I've tried to do that, and it's very interesting because I seem to be getting more reactions to what I put on there since I've been doing that. I might say to you that I put a posting on Facebook about 15 minutes before we went on the air, actually. It was one of those things which I just could not resist doing because in 2 or 3 visits to Facebook this morning, I've become almost overwhelmed by the number of postings from people here in West Virginia who are doing everything they can do to disown President Obama, who is scheduled to make an appearance in West Virginia this afternoon. He's here because of the states ranking near the top of states with the problem of medication overdoses and prescription drug abuse. He's here to conduct a public forum to try to do something about that. And of course, what he's getting are all of these negative comments about his war on coal and EPA's war and all of these jobs in West Virginia. One of the postings I saw on there today suggested that President Obama may be president of the United States, but he's not West Virginia's president, etc. I couldn't resist this morning. I had to say, in fact, the posting was from a particular friend of mine. I have to say, I hate to tell you, my friend, but he really is our president. But anyway, in all of this, I kept thinking, this is so terrible. This is so unbelievable. The lead story in our local paper this morning, just as an aside, before we get into our the regular content of our program today, I just kind of have to sound off a little bit about this. But the lead story in our local paper, besides the fact that the president's coming to West Virginia today, is a story about our Attorney General. Our Attorney General, whose name is Morrisey, is not a West Virginian. In fact, he came into West Virginia specifically to run for the Republican nomination for president. It was an example of the Republican Party seeking to take advantage of a state that was clearly moving into the red column. And obviously, Republicans saw this as a way to oust our longtime Attorney General in West Virginia, Darrell McGraw, and indeed the campaign was successful. And so we have had in office as West Virginia's Attorney General, Mr. Morrisey. The lead article or the lead item or piece of news in this morning's paper, other than the president coming here, is that the Attorney General's office yesterday employed a Republican political consultant whose last job was to basically work in the campaign of the Republican governor in the state of Maine. It is very interesting because the salary approaches $100,000 a year, which means that this is public money, West Virginia tax money, paying this salary. The person has no legal experience at all, even though he's been hired in the premier law firm in the state, which is the Attorney General's office. His whole resume speaks to his background as a political consultant and a political operative. And at the same time, there is an indication that this particular individual was involved in a Republican conference call last Friday about engaging and organizing Republican protests against the arrival of President Obama in West Virginia today. It just struck me so unbelievably absurd that while people are citizens are obsessing over President Obama coming to the state, this kind of thing is going on at the same time, and people don't see the contradictions and the absurdity in that. In the course of preparing for today's program, one of the sources that I came across is a letter written in 1819. And let me be more specific. I believe it was in March of 1819, but I want to make sure I'm accurate here. This letter was written on the 12th of March, 1819, from John Adams, who, of course, in 1824 is going to be elected President of the United States, a New Englander, which is going to break the train. John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, is going to be elected president in 1824. John Adams was president in 1796 to 1800. He was president between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. I'm getting my Adamses confused here. But anyway, Adams wrote a letter to John Taylor of Caroline on the 12th of March, 1819, in which he was berating banks, big banks. And in that letter, he made the comment and said, quote, I've never had but one opinion concerning banking. From the institution of the first bank in Philadelphia by Mr. Robert Morris and Mr. Gouverneur Morris, and that opinion has uniformly been that banks have done more injury to the religion, morality, tranquility, prosperity, even the wealth of the nation than they can have done or ever will do good. And then he closes the statement with what I think is the ultimate kicker. He says they, meaning banks, are like party spirit, the delusion of the many for the interests of the few, unquote. Party spirit, the delusion of the many for the interests of the few. And so the posting that I put on Facebook just before we came on the air made reference to that in terms of what's happening in West Virginia today. And just made the point that while West Virginians are doing everything they can do to make it clear that they don't want President Obama in our state because what they believe he's done to our economy, I wonder what John Adams would say to West Virginians on this beautiful Wednesday in October. And so the question that I put on Facebook is, I hope we'll think about this. And let's just pause for a moment and think about this. Who is really winning here? I believe that in what I hear in the Sanders campaign, I'm hearing that same question asked more and more and more by the candidate. I think all of us would do well to take a moment or two and think about this. While we obsess over things that really do us no good, who wins? One of the other resources that I was looking at in preparation for today's program is a pretty well-known one. It's George Washington's farewell address, written in 1796, delivered in 1796, when Washington announced that he was not going to be a candidate for a third term as President of the United States. It's a document that many people focus on, that many people reference, but it's one of those documents that not all that many people actually ever read. My plans are to spend a little bit of time in that document today because I want to get into the issue of the development and origin of political parties in America in the 1790s with the adoption or the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. I want to look at the idea of political parties as Americans first looked upon them, and then I want to eventually merge into what we have today as America's well-established two-party system, constantly thinking throughout about how what we learn informs some of the issues and some of the priorities and challenges that we face in today's America, in today's nation. So I think this is an important issue. I think it will be. And I hope that as we devote the bulk of our program to these matters today, that you will find it informative, helpful, and I hope somewhat interesting. Again, I do invite you to pick up the phone and give us a call. We would love to hear from you at 304-663-4676. Should you have a point of view or a comment that you would like to share with our other listeners, I know that they would all appreciate it. Before we get into this 18th century stuff, I just wanted to go back and make a comment or two or a reference, and I mentioned yesterday that I would be doing that on the issue of Common Core, which we spent our entire program on yesterday. Of course, it was an abbreviated 90-minute program, as our Tuesday programs regularly are. But it focused principally on the Common Core and the challenges to the Common Core as they exist. And as I thought back last evening to yesterday's program, I just couldn't resist going to the particular learning objective that we focus so much attention on, namely the one which speaks to the issue of looking at two different treatments or two different approaches of the same subject, and looking at how that particular objective evolves from early in a child's education, grade 3, up through the rest of elementary school, through middle school, and then finally through high school. And I think we did that yesterday. We looked at not only the so-called anchor objective, which is the core objective of exposing youngsters to different points of view on the same topic, but then looking specifically at how that particular objective became more complex as the grade level increased, as students matured. That reality, and I think you can apply that to the other objectives in the Common Core as well. It's that reality that led me to the conclusion that the principal issue associated with the Common Core is skill development that is developmental. And what I mean is, it's the identification or the targeting of specific skills associated with critical thinking and problem solving, and developing those skills through grade levels as they escalate, to the point that these become accomplished behaviors of graduates. It seems to me that this is what makes the Common Core reform movement in education different than previous reform movements, because previous reform movements have focused principally on content, on subject matter. But one of the things that never changes, irrespective of the changes in subject matter and the changes in focus, one of the things that has never changed previously is what we expect our young people in our public education system to do with content. We expect them to master it. We expect them to memorize it. We don't necessarily expect them to understand it. What we want them to do is remember it. And the whole idea there is to focus on a system of education which is directed more toward the establishment of acceptable beliefs and attitudes than in operative behavioral skills that give people the opportunity to educate themselves. This, I believe, is where the Common Core is different. I truly believe that its developmental nature is basically oriented towards empowering individual students. And the potential of it, because of the regular measurement of it through tests, through testing, is to be able to intervene when trouble is evident before that trouble emerges. In other words, before kids actually find themselves falling behind. By regularly measuring and comparing with others the available mastery of these skills at particular levels, grade by grade by grade, teachers, counselors are able to anticipate problems before they become real problems and to strategize or to come up with intervention strategies to fix problems before they become serious problems. I believe that this is potentially a way to save students, to keep students in the game, to give them the opportunity to realize their own abilities and their own skills and their own potential. I believe that the Common Core, unlike any other reform movement that I've seen, offers the potential of self-learning for students. It empowers students and gives them some control over their own educational direction, potential, and ultimate accomplishment. I think the freedom that we traditionally associate with education is attainable through this system, as it's been in no other reform movement that I've seen. But the thing, and this is where we finished yesterday's program, I think the thing that disturbs me most is the opposition to the Common Core. Opposition that has nothing to do with the substance of the program, but has everything to do with the politics surrounding it. Where it came from, who's funding it, who's paying for it, who's pushing it, who wants it most, the degree to which the federal government is advocating it, the degree to which it's liable to weaken or ultimately destroy local control over our schools, community involvement in curriculum, all of these things that tradition tells us we must take for granted. And in the process of pursuing those objectives, we have seen our educational system fail the bulk of our students miserably. Oh yes, some of our students, the best prepared, those from the best families, those who go to private, very expensive finishing schools and prep schools, they do quite well in this system. Because the goal is to move them on. But for the masses, the ones who have been fed the delusion of equality of educational opportunity without ever having before been given that equality of opportunity, now are on the edge of getting that opportunity. And it scares me to death that we might squander it. Because I have no choice but to believe, not that many of those who are opposed to the Common Core are doing it for insidious or unethical reasons. I don't believe that. In most cases, I think it's because they really don't understand the nature of the reform movement, how it differs from others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's partly our job. But for those who are leading the movement against the Common Core, those who are putting up the money to elect people through our state legislatures who are being given marching orders to do everything they can to defuse and ultimately defeat this Common Core standard reform movement, I have to believe that there's more understanding and more appreciation of the potential. I have to believe that some people, not all of them, but some people are opposed to the Common Core for the very reasons that I support it. Because this time, reform might actually work. And I don't think many of these people, some of these people at least, want education to work for the bulk of our children. I don't know that they fully understand or appreciate what it is their position symbolizes or reflects. I'm not really sure about that. But I do know that this system represents and promises change in our education tradition. And many of these people are opposed to that change. And part of the reason is because the long-term potential of these changes is to bring more people into the forefront of opportunity and challenge in our society. It is finally, after all of these years and all these generations, it is a way to begin to raise questions about entitlement of certain people from certain kinds of wealthy backgrounds. At the potential of a reform movement, I believe, that gives us the opportunity to render more people competitive for more of these opportunities. I think that's what free education in a society like ours is about. I think that that's part of the potential of this society. I think it's what makes this particular republic potentially an exceptional society. But I don't believe we're there yet. I don't believe we can rest on our laurels. And I think we have to do everything we can to block those who would try to argue that any change risks our status as exceptional. We are not exceptional. What makes us exceptional is our potential, our promise to do more for more people than any other society in the history of the modern world. It's about time we get about that mission. And I think Common Core is a significant piece of that effort. That's why I support it. All of it, obviously, it's contingent on the way we prepare our teachers, on the way we fund our schools, on the way we reward our teachers, on the way society looks at education. I read the other day the quote from George Will about how some people choose to be teachers, others choose to be managers of hedge funds. The more I think about that statement, it just absolutely runs all over me. As somebody who spent 50 years teaching, to confront a statement like that from somebody who ought to know better. The implication, of course, is that those who choose to teach and spend their careers not making a lot of money are getting what they deserve. Whereas those who choose to go into the hedge fund business and become fabulously wealthy, by implication, are getting what they deserve. I absolutely refuse to accept that. So I think that's where we are. I think that's what our program yesterday was about. I hope in your mind, and let me kind of conclude this with this statement. I hope in your mind, and I've tried to do this, that you can mark down October 20th, 2015 in your mind as a significant date. Because that was the date on which we did our 90-minute program on Common Core. And I'm hoping that later on, weeks, months from now, that you'll remember that date. And you'll say, damn it, I've got an hour and a half with nothing better to do. I'm going to go to the whiterosesociety.org, or I'm going to go to YouTube, and I'm going to look up the Virtual Center program for October 20th, 2015. Because I can't remember exactly what it was about. I just remember that the program on that particular date was important. And then maybe 6 months from now, or 6 years from now, you'll go back and revisit that program. And depending on how long it is from now, I'm hoping that the potential of Common Core will be in the process of being realized. I'm encouraged by Kentucky's experience in 4 years to increase the college readiness and career readiness of high school graduates from 38% to 62% in 4 years. That's pretty encouraging. This is Kentucky we're talking about. There are other states that you might expect that kind of educational progress to come from. Kentucky's not one of them. I think it speaks to the potential of the system itself, of the reform, and the developmental process for teachers, which can and must make it work. So again, I hope, and one of the things that I've got going for that we've got going for us, I think, is that October 20th is the day before October 21st, 2015, which all the media have been focusing on, in which Back to the Future predicted that the Chicago Cubs would win the World Series. And that the 21st of October 2015, which is today. What I'm hoping is you remember, one day prior to Back to the Future's prediction of October 21st, there was a program on Common Core available in the archives of the Virtual Center on the Head On Radio Network that spoke to the issue of Common Core. I think it's one of the most important programs we've done. I hope, I trust that you might agree. But I would like to get back a little bit into the 18th century, and more specifically into the ratification of the Constitution, which we spent so much time on here at the Virtual Center in previous months, but more importantly, on what followed. The interest, I mentioned this the other day as a direction that I thought would be very valuable for us to go in, is the development of political parties in America. Parties as they were originally viewed in the late 18th century, and party in America as it's come to be viewed through the 19th and 20th into the 21st century in our American experience. We've mentioned before, more than once, that America has a unique two-party system that kind of governs our electoral process, the way we choose our representatives and our leaders. By being a two-party system, it comes down to an either-or choice situation. It's a system that tends to force participating citizens into an either-or decision. If you don't like this particular agenda, this particular group in power, then there is the other one. And the party out of power spends most of its time and most of its resources in preparing strategies to regain that power, to regain the trust and the faith and the support of the majority of American voters. That's the way our system works. What I would ask you to think about is the resulting nature of this either-or kind of system. By definition, it suggests to us that only one of the two major parties can win. I think this is particularly important to think about because we do have in our society, in our history, a tradition of third-party movements in our society that have been very successful, some of them more successful than others. The one that comes to mind, obviously, is the late 19th century, early 20th century populist movement. But I call your attention to the fact that one of the Democratic candidates, current Democratic candidates for president, Jim Webb of Virginia, pulled out of the race yesterday and is contemplating running as an independent because he believes that the political lay of the land this time around seems to suggest the possibility that independent candidates, third-party efforts, could be successful where they've not been successful before. And many of us will recall a few months ago the pressure that the Republican Party was putting on Donald Trump to openly avow his support for the ultimate Republican candidate. And you remember that when the race first began, Donald Trump was holding in his, was holding back and threatening the possibility of an independent run as a third-party candidate should he believe, and I'm using his words here, that mainstream Republican Party and the media was treating him unfairly. In other words, he reserved the right to abandon the Republican Party and run as an independent. And the very first Republican debate, if you'll recall, featured the very first question to Donald Trump: whether in fact there was anybody on the stage that would not publicly commit to supporting the ultimate Republican candidate. And you'll recall that the only hand that went up was Donald Trump's. But after the first debate, and since that time, Donald Trump has committed to the idea that he will support the Republican candidate. And yesterday, he was asked a question about Jeb Bush, and if Jeb Bush happened to get the nomination, would Donald Trump support him? And he promised that he would. So the issue of third-party independent runs has been very significant in our history. But the fact of the matter is, the nature of the two-party system is such that one or the other of the two major parties is the one that's going to win. And the reason for that is the majority winner-take-all nature of our political system. We do not have a system which rewards close seconds. In our system, you win it or you lose it. You get all of the votes of that particular state or you get none of them. In many republics throughout the world, in many other democratic systems, so-called, those particular systems feature what we call proportional representation. In other words, the number of seats in legislatures that individual parties get is based on the percentage of the vote they get at the elections. And of course, what that means is that these democracies, as it were, tend to be what we call multi-party democracies. And they feature proportional representation. And the result is that very often, most often, in multi-party systems, one party does not get the overall majority, 51%, necessary to form the government. So more often than not, the winning party, the party with the plurality, the most votes, gets to set up the government But what they must set out to do is form coalitions among other parties in order to try to reach a majority coalition that can govern, that has enough support and enough unity to agree on particular agenda items. There are obviously advantages to that kind of a system, and there are disadvantages as well. And the difference between those particular systems and ours will pretty much depend on which side of the fence you're on. In other words, if you are a supporter or a citizen in one of those multi-party political systems, you'll tend to be very critical of our either-or winner-take-all system because it doesn't reward seconds and thirds. It doesn't reward those people whose votes are not in the majority. By being a winner-take-all system, those people that vote in the minority end up with no representation at all. Many people believe that that's unfair, that it tends to encourage people to not participate and not vote. Because unless they feel that they have a chance of winning, there's no reason to vote. Because if they don't win, they get no reward, they get no representatives at all. On the other hand, if you are in our system looking at the others, if you are a citizen within this winner-take-all system of ours, you look on these particular features of our system as positives, and you look at the other multi-party systems as deficient. Because the strength of our system, because it's winner-take-all, is that it forces political opinions toward the center. It's a system which rewards consensus and negotiation. It rewards compromise. Because the only thing that our political system rewards is winning. If you don't get the majority, you lose. You don't get to keep a portion of the win, you totally lose. You either totally win or you totally lose. And because our system is a winner-take-all system like that, then by definition, the agenda and the positions of the two parties competing for victory must be moderate. Because the number one objective of each party is to reach out and attract as many members as possible, even if it means members of the other party crossing the aisle. How many times have we heard about Ronald Reagan's success in attracting so-called Republican Democrat, working class Democrats, Reagan Democrats, so-called. I was getting confused there. Reagan Democrats, which were working class traditional Democratic voters who crossed over and supported Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. In other words, Reagan's success was his ability to draw that kind of support from so many different sources. That's what our political system is all about. And the history of our political system speaks to those particular priorities. For example, our history tells us that when one party becomes overwhelmingly dominant, and with the result being that the other party becomes woefully weak and inefficient. When our two-party system seems to somewhat break down, and one party ends up with all the votes, and I'm thinking of those elections where only one or two states went Republican or went Democrat. I'm thinking, for example, of the overwhelming victories of Ronald Reagan in the 1984 election. I'm thinking of the overwhelming victory of Lyndon Johnson in 1964 against Barry Goldwater, where the Democratic victory was so overwhelming that the consensus-building, compromise nature of our two-party system was in jeopardy. What usually happens, our history tells us, is that when one party wins such an overwhelming majority, it usually runs into difficulty in trying to govern, because factionalism within the majority party begins to surface, and the party usually breaks up into a number of warring factions. And whereas one would think that the overwhelming strength of the party would enable it to have its way, enact its agenda, and govern according to its particular will, the reality is that that rarely happens. From becoming too extreme one way or the other in its positions or on its agenda, in the particular items or particular pieces of legislation that it wants to pass. In other words, parties know that if it becomes too extreme conservative or too extremely liberal, then it's going to drive fringe supporters from its own party into the hands of the competitive, of the other party. And when that happens, its ability to govern comes into question. So the very nature of our two-party system tends to keep our entire electoral process focused principally on moderation, on the center, on the need to ultimately build compromise. And that's a strength. So the result has been throughout our history that our two-party system, rather than tear us apart over politics, tends more often than not to bring us together. I would suggest all of these strengths, all of these arguments or positions that seem to speak to the strength of our two-party system are currently in jeopardy, given what's happening in Washington and what's happening with our two-party system. The dysfunction in Washington, the inability of parties or candidates to reach across the aisle and find ways to work with those with members of the other party. The dysfunction that seems to be underway within the Republican Party right now, as they can't seem to find somebody who'll be Speaker. It appears that they might have Paul Ryan, provided the so-called Freedom Caucus, the 35 or 40 extremely conservative members of the Republican caucus, are willing to put aside their lockstep behavior and are willing to get behind Paul Ryan's leadership as Speaker of the House. That seems to be his principal negotiating point. If they do that, he'll do it. If they won't commit to that, he won't. All in all, it seems to me, the nature of our two-party system is a critical feature of our entire political process. However, the reality is that parties are not part of our Constitution. Not only is there no mention of parties in the Constitution, but those who ratified and supported the Constitution committed to do everything they can do to prevent the emergence of parties. The general assumption was that in a popular government, in a republic, if government really does reflect the public interest, if the behavior and activities of those elected to office really do reflect the priorities of citizens, then there's no need for parties. There's no need for an opposition. There's no sense that the system would be improved by legitimizing or legalizing what we call loyal opposition, an alternative voice. The general thinking was that in a popular government, which is really reflecting the will of the people, then those people who are unwilling to go along with what government is doing when it is reflecting the will of the people are, in effect, enemies to the public will, to the common good. They are traitors. And by definition, in a popular government, in a republic, if government is doing what it was intended to do, then there ought not to be opposition. The role of good citizens is to support their government when their government is doing what it was created to do. It's very simplistic, but that's the way George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and others looked at the system. The fact of the matter is, however, that that's very idealistic, especially in a popular government, in a society which puts a priority and premium on individual freedom. Because by definition, if you leave no room for dissent, if you leave no room for opposition, if you deny people the right to disagree or the right to dissent, you give people no choice. They either must cave and surrender to the will of the majority popular government, which was at play at the time the Constitution was ratified, has within it the seeds of its own destruction. Because by definition, it is a perspective that drives individuals out of the system rather than inviting them into the system. And so what we have historically then is an example of the gradual evolution or transition of the attitude and approach toward parties from opposing them and seeing them as dangerous in the early years of the nation's history under the Constitution to the eventual recognition that parties have a very important function to provide in the sustaining and strength of our republic. Because by providing a loyal opposition, an alternative point of view, you give people choice. You give those who dissent a place to go, short of leaving the system and becoming an enemy to their own political system. We don't see that reflected early on in the nation's history under the Constitution, but we indeed see it reflected later. And one of the most important issues, it seems to me, in the nation's early history, from the 1790s through the early 19th century, up through and including the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, is the playing out of this evolutionary process in terms of the competing attitudes towards parties. Our modern contemporary idea or attitude towards two parties becomes finally operative in the 1820s and 30s. As many of the things we take for granted now in our two-party politics become operative during those periods. The acknowledgement of the right of alternative parties to exist. In other words, the recognition of the principle of what we call the idea of loyal opposition. That one can disagree without becoming a traitor. We can mutually disagree among ourselves on particular issues. That's a principle that takes a while to grab hold in this country, but it's a very important one. And once all of this comes into play, it becomes possible to elect an Andrew Jackson as President of the United States. A candidate like Jackson, who has none of the background, the pedigree of the original or the early presidents of the United States, the Washingtons and the Adamses and the Jeffersons and the Monroes and the Adamses. These are people that were born into positions of influence, prestige, and power. These are people who were born to govern. And they ended up inheriting the office of President of the United States in the nation's initial years. But once you open up the system and make it possible for the masses of common people, as it were, to participate in the system by voting, then the election for president becomes, for lack of a better term, a popularity contest. And it becomes possible for somebody with none of the attributes or none of the traits of a Washington or a Jefferson to be elected president. Gordon Wood, in his very famous book, his prize-winning book on the American Revolution, the radicalism of the American Revolution, makes the comment in the very last chapter in his epilogue that none of the founding generation, those people that were around in the late 19th century and actually participated in independence and the Constitution of the United States, by the time you get to 1830 and in the years immediately after that, most of these people are dying off. Madison, for example, dies in 1836, but he's in his 90s. People don't usually live that long then. So most of the revolutionary generation, so to speak, is gone by the time you get into the late 1820s and early 1830s. Gordon Wood makes the statement that not one of the revolutionary generation died happy, because many of them saw what was happening in American politics. And for them, the election of Andrew Jackson was the final straw in the dismantling of the American Republic. And Gordon Wood makes the point that people who saw a gentleman, a man like George Washington, as being the epitome of what a true American ought to be about, these people are appalled to think that the President of the United States was Andrew Jackson, who participated in duels, who killed people, whose morality and ethics were constantly in question, who had been tried over and over again for violations of the law. This was, in the minds of the revolutionary generation, the epitome of a person you never want to hold the office of president. And so Gordon Wood's comment was, very few of the revolutionary generation died happy, because they died believing that all they had accomplished with independence and the Constitution of the United States was going down the proverbial tube. And the election of Andrew Jackson, in their minds, probably confirmed that. It's important for us to recognize, and I'm bringing this to a conclusion here because I think we're approaching the end of our first, well, we actually did pass the top of our first hour, so let me bring this to a logical conclusion. It's important to recognize that the process of decline that the revolutionary generation saw in the difference between George Washington as president and Andrew Jackson as president reflects exactly the transition from opposition to parties at the very beginning to the acceptance of the legitimacy of two parties and the idea of a loyal opposition to come. Both of those things are different versions of the same issue. In other words, the changes that made the election of Andrew Jackson possible as president are the changes in the political process associated with the emergence and ultimate acceptance of the idea of political parties in America. With this background, I'd like to spend our second hour going into the early period right after ratification of the Constitution and beginning to look at the origin, the emergence of political parties in America, and begin to look seriously at some of the issues associated with the emergence of parties and the concern and worry and fear that many people had about parties and what they would do to our republic. But I think we've reached the point where we need to pause and take our traditional 5-minute break here in our regular Monday and Wednesday programs. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is now 4 minutes after the top of the hour, 4 minutes after 2 in the East. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll have a full 50-minute expose on the emergence and attitude towards parties in America in the 1790s. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour here in this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I think it's important to mention the date again. Today is the 21st day of October in the year 2015. It is the day that Back to the Future talked about some years ago. And I mention this because the Cubs are losing 3-0 as we speak and are in danger of being driven out of the playoffs in their next game. So, but be that as it may, it's a beautiful day in a beautiful season of the year, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this Wednesday. I want to thank you for staying with us. If you've been with us since the very beginning of our program today, if you are just joining us, I want to welcome you to this, our second hour of the program today. The topic, for those of you just joining us, is two parties, and we spent quite a bit of time in our first hour talking about the nature of America's two-party system and how it differs from multi-party systems in other democracies throughout the world. The principal issue, of course, being the recognition of proportional representation. In other words, depending on the particular position of each party in the election in that particular country, the assigning of representative seats in the legislature is proportional to the turnout or to the results of the previous election. What that means is that there's no incentive built into the system for compromise. The compromise comes from the leaders of the parties after the election is over, when the party with the most votes seeks to build coalitions among parties that lost the election. And so, of course, what it does, it means that those parties that never have a chance of winning the majority vote and getting control of government oftentimes can influence government policy by the fact that the winning party has to come to them and seek to work in coalition, in conjunction with them, in order to get anything done. So that gives them influence and power. The American system, on the other hand, because it's an either-all, winner-take-all system, tends to drive both parties towards the center in terms of their positions and their agendas. It encourages and promotes compromise because the system only rewards victory. It does not reward defeat. There's no such thing as proportional representation. If you get 20% of the vote, that doesn't mean that you get 20% of the elected representatives. You get zero. On the other hand, if you get 50.1% of the election, you get all 100% of the elected representatives. So it's totally a winner-take-all system. And because only winning matters, by definition, that means that the priority has to be on consensus building and on finding ways to compromise and bring people together. And in a disparate society like ours, with so many different interests and so many different points of view, so many different religious groups, and so many different national groups from all different parts of the world, it would seem that a system which builds consensus and seeks and promotes compromise would be the most logical and beneficial way to go. In other words, it so happens that our political system conforms perfectly to the social aspects of our nation and the population of our nation. A divided, potentially disparate population needs something, some way to be brought together so that people can work together and live together. And our political system, as it was conceived, is designed to accomplish just that. And in today's world, many people, myself included, are becoming very disturbed and discouraged by what we see on the national level in our party system. But I would suggest that's another issue for another day. As we mentioned, as the lead-in to this particular hour, I wanted to spend at least some time today, and we'll get back to this, of course, next week, in the early period of the 1790s and begin to look at the emergence of parties as a political reality in American society after the adoption of the Constitution and the inauguration of George Washington as first president of the United States in March of 1789. We do solicit your opinions, your calls, your ideas, your comments, your suggestions, whatever you might want to share with our other listeners. We have a phone line reserved to get you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me, is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. One of the issues that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, although I really want to move beyond this, but I think we need to begin somewhere. There's absolutely no question that the division or the split in America prior to the Constitution's ratification between the so-called Federalists and Anti-Federalists, those supporting the Constitution and those opposing it, in the minds of many historians, constituted a split or the emergence of parties in American politics. These groups in each state, opponents of the Constitution versus supporters of the Constitution, became so prominent and so recognizable that in the eyes of many people, it would not be incorrect to label these as an early or America's, what some people refer to as America's first party system. Because basically, the issue at hand was the Constitution. Those opposed to it ended up on one side of the spectrum, political spectrum, those in favor of it on the other. Of course, the fact of the matter is you can go all the way back to the very beginning, to the War for Independence itself, and you can look at the split in American colonial society between patriots and Tories or loyalists, and you can trace the first American parties there by the divisions that existed between those that supported independence and those that held out to the very end in efforts to try to find some compromise position with the mother country in order to avoid independence. If you look at these kinds of major divisions and label them parties, then the emergence of Republicans and Jeffersonians in the 1790s really becomes America's third round of party division. Loyalists versus patriots in 1776, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists in 1787, 1788, and Republicans and Federalists, so-called, in the 1790s. But there's absolutely no question that those historians who have really spent time on this particular subject have pretty well concluded that whatever there was of so-called parties at the time of ratification, the differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, pretty much disappeared early on in the Washington administration, despite the fact that the first congressional elections under the Constitution for the first Congress were fought out tooth and nail between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Opponents of the Constitution believed that they could realize ultimate success even though the Constitution was ratified. They still had a chance to be successful if they could somehow win control of the first Congress. So in state after state, in the so-called first federal elections under the Constitution, the elections for the first Congress and the first Senate, candidates tended to identify themselves as Federalists or Anti-Federalists. And if you read the newspapers of the period, in state after state, you will see evidences of Federalists and Anti-Federalists, argument in favor of the Constitution on the one hand, arguments in favor of those opposed to it on the other. In fact, one of the favorite arguments of Anti-Federalists in the first elections was, now that the Federalists have won, now that the Constitution is ratified, it's very important that the Constitution's actual implementation be in the hands of people that are not fully 100% advocates of the system. That the only intelligent, sensible way to put the Constitution in operation successfully and wisely is to turn the initial implementation over to people that had serious questions about it, because they were the ones that really knew what the Constitution was about. They were the ones, because they had serious questions about the Constitution, they were the ones who best understood it, and they were the ones that the nation could best trust to put it into operation. And so there was a tremendous fear on the part of Federalists, and you can see this reflected in the letters of Hamilton and Washington and John Jay and many of the others, and Madison, of course, that what happens to the Constitution if the Anti-Federalists win control of Congress? One of the things that was in the offing during ratification, one of the things that was threatened and really frightened Madison and the other supporters of the Constitution was the potential or the idea for the calling of a second convention to consider amendments. Many of the states, actually 7 of the 13, well 7 of the 12, because Rhode Island did not ratify right away. 12 states did. So 7 of the 12 had mentioned as part of ratification the issue of amendments. A few of them didn't require amendments, they just suggested them and said, we ratify, but we fully expect that one of the first orders of business will be to pass amendments to the Constitution. So immediately the contest for election in the first Congress became meaningful, because depending on whether Federalists controlled the first Congress or whether Anti-Federalists controlled the first Congress, that would determine the kinds of the kinds of amendments that would be considered. And it becomes very clear in many states, especially the later states that ratify the Constitution, that whereas early on amendments were recommended, they weren't specified. But gradually, states, especially the states of Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, because it didn't ratify the first time, it had to come back into session and ratify the second time. These states began to propose specific amendments. Many states accompanied their votes of ratification with recommended amendments, agendas of amendments. And so the result is that when the first Congress meets, and James Madison is successful in getting the first Congress to follow through on its commitment to consider amendment, it turns out that there are a total of 237 different amendments recommended by the various states. And so Madison ends up chairing the committee of the House, which is charged with sifting through these 237 amendments and coming up with a slate of proposals that Congress, with the approval of the Senate, would send out to the states for ratification. And as we know, the final vote that comes in includes 10 amendments as part of what we call America's Bill of Rights. But it becomes very clear early on that the debate over amendments and the debate or the contest for election to the first Congress become connected directly. Because Madison, Hamilton, and the others really worry that if the first Congress is controlled by anti-federalists, then the amendments that come out of Congress are going to be very dangerous amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Let me, if I can, take a moment and explain what the difference is. It becomes very clear in reading the literature during this period that there are two different kinds of amendments being proposed and being kicked around. There are those amendments that fall clearly into the category of human rights. Religious freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to bear arms, etc., etc., etc. There are a number of amendments that come from different states that pertain directly to individual rights, to human rights. Madison and the others don't really have an issue with these. Because Madison realizes from the very beginning that the Constitution of the United States really didn't have anything to do with individual rights. That wasn't what it was about. It was about state power versus federal power. And so when Madison finally concedes and gives in to the idea of amendments, he's more than willing to support amendments in the area of human rights. But there are other kinds of amendments being proposed as well. And these amendments would be much more substantive, much more directed towards the Constitution of the United States itself. In effect, they would be amendments designed to weaken the powers of the federal government, which the Constitution gave it. For example, they would be amendments that qualified the federal government's right to tax, the federal government's right to raise an army, the federal government's right to control trade and commerce. In these areas, which are very substantive areas, amendments would materially affect the outcome of the Constitution itself being ratified. And so while Madison and the other Federalists are willing to condone human rights amendments, they are very, very skeptical and very afraid of the other kind of substantive amendments which are designed to weaken the power of the central government and return some of the powers of the state governments taken away by ratification back to the states. In other words, if the anti-federalists controlled the first Congress, there was every expectation in the world that the amendments which came out of a Congress made up of people who opposed the Constitution, the results would be amendments being proposed which would potentially emasculate the power of the federal government and thereby eliminate ratification itself. They would all but counter or contradict ratification. And so therefore, it becomes absolutely vital to Madison and Hamilton and Jay the Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris and the other supporters of the Constitution in various states, Fisher Ames of Massachusetts, and on and on and on. It becomes very important that Federalists win seats in this first Congress. And the results of the elections turn out to be that they do just that. That relatively speaking, there aren't that many anti-Federalists that are successful in the first federal elections. The first Congress is overwhelmingly Federalist. So much so that President Washington and Madison and many of the others are able to breathe a sigh of relief and acknowledge to each other in writing, it looks like we dodged a bullet here. I think we finally won. And for all practical purposes, anti-federalism dies with the first federal elections. More specifically, the Bill of Rights killed it. There's absolutely no question that Congress's willingness to consider amendments to the Constitution and to impose or to attach a Bill of Rights to the Constitution of the United States effectively destroyed or emasculated opposition to the Constitution itself. Obviously, the amendments included in the Bill of Rights did not satisfy the anti-federalists. Madison and his group were meticulous in making sure that the amendments that were included and made up the Bill of Rights didn't materially affect the power of the federal government under the Constitution. To put it kind of bluntly, and I don't mean to be cute here, but you could really say that the Bill of Rights, in a way, was a sop. It was kind of a joke. From the perspective of Madison and Hamilton and the other Federalists, the amendments that ended up in the Bill of Rights were meaningless because they didn't really affect the meaning of the Constitution at all. And the reason I say this is because today, when you talk about the Constitution of the United States, that's all people talk about are rights. The implication today is that the Bill of Rights is the Constitution. But the reality is that the amendments included in the Bill of Rights were safe, at least from the perspective of those who drafted and most advocated, most supported ratification of the Constitution. I've mentioned before an article that came out in the William and Mary Quarterly some years ago that was written by a good friend of mine, Ken Bowling. He and I went to graduate school together. And the title of Ken's article was A Tub to the Whale, the passage of the Bill of Rights. And Ken Bowling goes back to Jonathan Swift's story about the way that whalers harpooned whales. The way that, in the old wooden boats with oars, the way that you whaled, the way that you successfully harpooned and landed whales is to distract them. And so what many of these sailors did was they would take a wooden tub and they would throw it in the water And as it bobbed around in the water, it would attract the attention of the whales. The whales would be drawn to the tub, and the sailors could kill it. Ken Bowling's thesis was that the Bill of Rights constituted what he called a tub to the whale. In other words, the amendments were a diversion. They were really rather meaningless compared to the substantive amendments that were not included in the Bill of Rights. Therefore, they constituted a defeat for the Anti-Federalists. The only state that went into the first Congress with a powerful, vibrant voice for anti-federalism was Virginia. The two senators from Virginia were anti-federalists, Richard Henry Lee and Grayson. I believe his first name was William Grayson. They were out and out acknowledged, identified anti-federalists. Virginia was the only state to send two anti-federalists to the United States Senate. I believe there were only 5 total anti-federalists in the Senate. 2 of them came from Virginia. When Richard Henry Lee and Grayson got a look at the Bill of Rights, which finally came out of the Senate and was going to go to the states for ratification as the Bill of Rights, they wrote back to the governor of Virginia and said, "We would be better off without these. These are meaningless." But they're even more than meaningless. They're meaningful in the sense that they're going to satisfy the demand for amendments enough to kill any chance we ever have of getting meaningful amendments. In other words, what they were saying to the governor was, the Bill of Rights really was a tub to the whale. So the fact of the matter is then that with the passage of the Bill of Rights, the anti-federalist opposition to the Constitution effectively disappears. And you have within the Congress, theoretically, a vast majority of representatives in both houses who support the Constitution of the United States. It looks like the perfect setup for a harmonious administration for the new President George Washington. And of course, one cannot undervalue Washington as the first president. Many of the fears that people had about the power of the presidency, the power of the executive branch in the Constitution, many of those fears were blunted by the fact that most people understood that Washington would be the first president, and everybody trusted him. And so even those people who thought that the powers of the executive were dangerous were appeased by the fact that we don't have to worry because it's going to be Washington. He'll never abuse the powers of the office. And once we get underway and people begin to see we can make through amendment the kind of changes in the Constitution which might affect the power for future presidents. But while we've got Washington in office, we needn't worry, we're covered. So it looked like the perfect governing situation when Washington was inaugurated in 1789. As part of some of the research that I've been doing, I found some evidence of this. Let me share a couple of letters that pretty much ratify the interpretation that I've just thrown on this. On the 9th of May, 1789, and of course we know that Washington was inaugurated in March, so this letter is written 2 months after the first Congress begins to meet, after the new government is in session. Madison writes to Jefferson and says the following: in general, the interests and ideas of the northern and southern states have been less adverse than was predicted by the opponents or hoped by the friends of the new government. In other words, many of the fears we had that there would be splits between the northern states and the southern states have not come to fruition. They're getting along better than we ever accepted or believed that they would. Madison goes on and said, members from the same state or the same part of the Union are as often separated on questions from each other as they are united in opposition to other states or other quarters of the continent. The implication is that many of the divisions and much of the hostility that we expected might be visible in the first Congress has not come to fruition. Later that year, in November of '89, Madison writes to the president. He writes to President Washington. And he says, quote, as far as I can gather, the great bulk of the late appointments are entirely at rest and more likely to censure a further opposition to the government as now administered than the government itself. In other words, what Madison is saying to Washington is, it appears that much of the opposition that we were afraid would surface hasn't surfaced. And if there is any opposition at all, it's the particular individuals in the administration. And of course, early on, he's probably referring to Hamilton, although he doesn't identify him yet. But he's saying basically, one of the principal leaders of the Baptists lately sent me word, says Madison, that the amendments has entirely satisfied the disaffected of his sect of Baptists, and that it would appear in their subsequent conduct. Baptists especially were very, very worried about the Constitution of the United States because it didn't have the protection for freedom of religion. And when the Bill of Rights came out, Baptists accepted that and, for all practical purposes, dropped their opposition to the Constitution. The point I'm making here in these two letters from Madison, one to Jefferson and one to Washington, is that it's pretty clear early on that what there was of parties coming in to the new government between anti-federalists and federalists pretty much disappears with the Bill of Rights. And what we would identify as parties, pronounced, visible, clearly evident differences of opinion and divisions into major groups or major parties, at least at the beginning, is non-existent. All of that changes in late '89 and early 1790s with the financial program of Alexander Hamilton. When Washington appoints Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Congress immediately requests from the Secretary a series of reports on what he recommends for putting the economic vitality of the nation on wheels, for getting the economy of this country underway, Hamilton submits a series of reports on funding, on manufacturing, on banks, on the excise. And immediately, one begins to see a division within the Congress over this particular program. Translation: there's absolutely no question that the emergence of two parties, the emergence of political parties in the 1790s, is directly attributable to Alexander Hamilton's financial programs. I know we did a previous program here at the Virtual Center on Hamilton's program, and I don't want to necessarily revisit or beat a dead horse, but it seems to me significant that we at least understand the basic premise, the basic idea of Hamilton's programs. Hamilton recommends a 5-part program. The first 2 parts are really connected. The first one is funding of the national debt. The second step is assumption of state debts. What they mean is essentially the same thing. Hamilton believes that the first order of business of the new government must be to make good on the debts of the old government, on the debts of the Confederation. So therefore, what Hamilton recommends is that the Confederation debt be refunded. Now, what that means is not paid. Hamilton is not proposing that the debt of the Confederation government be paid. Hamilton has recommended that it be refunded. What that means is new certificates, new securities, new IOUs would be issued, and that those people that held the old IOUs under the Confederation would be able to come into federal offices set up for the purpose and redeem their certificates for new certificates issued by the new government under the Constitution. The new securities, or the new certificates, would carry an interest rate of 6%. What that means is the new government would pay holders of the certificates 6% interest every year on the unpaid balance. So if you own certificates, if you, for example, had a $1,000 IOU from the Confederate Congress for your service in Washington's Continental Army, you could bring your $1,000 IOU to a federal office and redeem it for a new certificate, which would be for $1,000 plus 6% annual interest. At the end of the first year, even if the government didn't have money to pay you the $1,000, it was at least obligated to pay you the 6% interest. You were at least beginning to get something. But to be very honest with you, $6 on an obligation of $1,000 is really not a whole hell of a lot. So it stands to reason that if you had your $1,000 IOU and you could find a way to get somebody else to take it, you'd be golden. Because if all you're going to get is $6 interest every year, the $1,000 IOU becomes effectively worthless. However, to speculators, it is not worthless. Because if I go in the business of speculating in these securities, if I go around and buy up as many of these $1,000 certificates as possible and redeem them, I'm going to get 6% interest for every one of them. So if I'm able to round up, let's say, $50,000 worth of certificates, then I'm going to get interest of 6% of $50,000 every year until the balance is paid. So the fact of the matter is, the funding program presents speculators with a tremendous opportunity to cash in on the new government. But on the other hand, most people aren't opposed to it, because most people believe with Hamilton that if the new government is going to get any respect or is going to establish any credibility in the world, it has to pay its debts. So nobody has a problem with that. But Madison has a problem with the speculation part. Madison really believes that it's not fair for those in the know, those with contacts, those with inside information, to go around and buy up these securities from unsuspecting holders of the securities who really don't know what's coming down the pike in terms of Hamilton's program. In other words, if I'm a speculator, I've got inside information that the government is going to refund the debt. Immediately, I'm going to go out and buy up as much of that debt as I can. But the only way I'm going to be able to successfully buy it up is if the people I'm buying it from don't know that funding is coming down the pike. Madison believes that that's not fair. Madison believes it's rewarding people who are taking advantage of the situation rather than the people who really gave of themselves for independence. In other words, the original holders of these certificates are the people that earned them. They earned the right to them. And Madison somehow wants these original holders to be rewarded. I'm getting into this, and I'm probably losing track of my time here. We're at 53 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 5 minutes left in our program today. So Madison proposes, to make a long story longer, Madison proposes that Congress make some effort to discriminate between the original holders and the speculators. Madison believes that if it's a speculator redeeming the certificates, they ought not to get the full 6% interest. They maybe only ought to get a third of that. Maybe they ought to get 2%, and the original holder get the 6%. In other words, he wants discrimination based on fairness. And immediately he runs into opposition from Hamilton. And Hamilton makes an impassioned plea against discrimination. It's important. This is the part I want to end the program with, because this is pretty much leading in to next week's programs on this, which I think is fascinating stuff. In order to understand Hamilton's opposition to discriminating between original holders and speculators, one must begin to understand what Hamilton's financial program is all about. To be blunt about it, Hamilton doesn't give a damn about fairness. Hamilton's program is aimed principally at benefiting the speculators, at buying the support of the people with money, the financial community, to the new government. The driving force behind Hamilton's program is to bind the financial power in the country to the new government by arranging to have the new government begin to make regular payments to those who hold these securities, this debt. So from Hamilton's point of view, speculating is not a problem. It's the point. He is able successfully to argue against Madison by arguing that to discriminate would be too complicated. It would make the whole process so complicated that it would never work, would never get done. What do we do, for example, if the same certificate, the same IOU, passed into 4 or 5 different hands before it was finally redeemed? How do we divide up the rewards, for example? In other words, Hamilton comes up with every conceivable argument in the book against the feasibility of discrimination. And finally, Congress votes against Madison. Then the next part of the program is assumption. And I won't go into all the details with this today. I think we'll begin with assumption when we come back next week. Let me just say that assumption is the same thing as funding, except that Hamilton not only wants the new government to refund the national debt, Hamilton wants the new government to refund all the debts held by the states themselves. If you remember, under the Confederation, the states could issue money, the states could issue IOUs. And so consequently, they have outstanding debts as well. Hamilton wants the new government to assume all of the state debts as well as the federal debt. And that's really what assumption and funding are all about. And we'll pick up there in our next program next Monday, and we'll begin. This is absolutely unbelievable stuff. I think that you will be blown away by this. I know I am. Every time I look at it, I find it so informative. So much of what's going on today makes some sense because of this particular story. So I hope that you will enjoy it. But right now we have to say goodbye. We're at 58 minutes after the hour. We got less than 2 minutes to go in today's program. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to thank you for this entire week of opportunities here at the Virtual Center. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. The weather is absolutely delightful. I hope you have a wonderful last part of the week. Please keep an eye on the Facebook page. I'll do the best I can to enter 2 or 3 posts between now and the time we get back together again. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On Radio Network, for the Virtual Center, I want to say thank you. I hope that you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week. Be kind to each other and be safe. Thank you.